Summer 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. With Allied troops fighting their way through Normandy, all nations of the world watched for Hitler's collapse. However, the Third Reich had one last terrifying surprise for the British home front. Vengeance Weapon 1, the V1 Buzz Bomb. It was a pure terror weapon. Launched from coastal batteries, it flew at 400 miles per hour. Its approach signaled only by a loud, sputtering roar that became the soundtrack of London's desperation. What made it uniquely horrifying was the silence. When the engine cut out, the people below had 10 seconds, just enough time for one last prayer before nearly a ton of high explosive detonated. For the German High Command, the V1 Buzz Bomb was mathematically invincible. It was a problem the Allies simply had no answer for. Their own scientists had already examined and dismissed the only possible solution as a theoretical impossibility. What they didn't account for was the quiet American answer. A tiny radio set, smaller than a man's hand, that they were about to build by the million, turning the laws of ballistics on their head. Outsur, terror and the certainty. In the early morning of June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day, London heard a sound that would haunt the city for months to come. It wasn't the familiar drone of bombers or the wail of sirens. It was something new. A pulsing roar that cut through the night sky like a chainsaw. Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe 1 had the sound, the Vengeance Weapon 1. The Brits called them buzz bombs or doodlebugs. To the people huddled in shelters and basements, they were simply terror given wings. Pulsejet engine produced that distinctive buzzing roar, loud enough to hear from miles away. You could track it across the sky, listen to it draw closer, and then silence. Mrs. Elizabeth Ward, a nurse in East London, later recalled the ritual of those summer nights. She said, "You'd freeze the moment you heard it, and when the engine died, you'd count. 1, 2, 3. If you made it to 10, you knew you'd live another day." By the end of June 1944, over 2,000 V1s had been launched at London. In Berlin, the mood among the Luftwaffe's technical staff was one of cold satisfaction. Oberst Max Wachtel, commander of Flak Regiment 155W, responsible for V1 operations, had run the numbers personally. He knew what the Allies were facing, and he knew they had no answer. Mathematics was devastating. A V1 flew at roughly 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. It was small, fast, and followed an unpredictable weaving path. To destroy it with conventional time-fused anti-aircraft shells required a direct hit or an explosion within 30 feet. Here was the impossible problem. A traditional time fuse required the gun crew to calculate the exact moment of detonation before firing. They had to estimate the missile's speed, its trajectory, and the shell's flight time. Then manually set a mechanical clockwork timer on the fuse. Tolerances were microscopic. If the calculation was off by even a tenth of a second, the shell would explode in empty air, hundreds of feet away from the target. Odds of a direct hit using time-fused shells were less than 1 in 10,000. At a technical briefing in late June, General Major Walter Dornberger, director of the V-Weapons program, made the assessment official. He said the British cannot stop the V1 with their current methods because the weapon will break their will. First cracks in certainty. By mid-July 1944, something strange began appearing in German reconnaissance reports from the Channel coast. Luftwaffe observers stationed in occupied France had been tasked with monitoring the effectiveness of Allied anti-aircraft fire against the V1s. What they reported back made no sense. Lieutenant Werner Steinhoff filed a report on July 18th that his commanding officer initially dismissed as a miscalculation. Steinhoff described watching V1s being destroyed by shells that exploded 50, sometimes 100 feet away from the missiles. Not near misses that got lucky, but consistent, repeatable kills at distances that should have been harmless. This effect was impossible. Time-fused shells didn't behave that way. By the end of July, the reports became undeniable. Anti-aircraft kill rates against the V-1 had jumped from roughly 10% to over 50% in certain sectors. The British had moved their entire gun belt to the coast, creating what they called the diver belt. On August 28, 1944, German intelligence recorded a day that shattered their mathematical certainty. 82% of launched V-1s were destroyed before reaching their targets. 94 V-1s were launched. Only 17 made it through. The figure was so absurd that Berlin initially refused to accept it. Oberstwachtel demanded verification, and the numbers were verified. Something had changed, and the Germans had no idea what it was. Third, they dismissed the problem. For years, the answer to the V-1 had been theoretically possible. German scientists had considered it, examined it, and dismissed it as fantasy. Its concept was even called a proximity fuse, a fuse that would detonate automatically when it sensed the target nearby, eliminating the need for human calculation and perfect timing. It was an elegant idea. It was also, by all accounts, impossible to build. Dr. Herbert Wagner had proposed a radio-based proximity system as early as 1940. His design called for a miniature radar transmitter embedded in the nose of an anti-aircraft shell. A timed transmitter would send out radio waves, and when those waves bounced back from a nearby aircraft, a receiver would detect the return signal and trigger the detonation. On paper, the physics worked. In practice, the engineering was a nightmare. An artillery shell experiences forces of 20,000 Gs or more when fired. 20,000 times the force of gravity, concentrated in a fraction of a second. Some components needed to survive. That shock had to be incredibly small and incredibly rugged. Even the most robust radio sets of the era were sensitive to rough handling. Their idea of building a functional radio that could be fired out of a cannon was, in the words of one of the German engineers, like trying to fire a grandfather clock made of fine crystal out of a gun barrel and expecting it to still tell time when it lands. German technical assessment was filed and forgotten. They concluded the idea was theoretically sound, but practically unachievable. They were half right. At least the problem was nearly unsolvable, and nearly left just enough room for American stubbornness and industrial scale to force a solution. 4. American miracle. While Germany dismissed the proximity fuse as impossible, a quiet team of American scientists and engineers had been working on the problem since 1940. This project was headquartered at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland, under the direction of physicist Merle Tuve. Tuve's team wasn't chasing elegance. They were chasing a function. They knew the delicate components couldn't survive, so they stopped trying to keep them delicate. Instead, they reinforced everything. The heart of the system was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit in the nose of a 5-inch anti-aircraft shell. Vacuums were redesigned entirely. Engineers borrowed techniques from hearing aid manufacturers who had learned to make tiny, durable components for portable devices. These tubes were embedded in wax and encased in shock-absorbent plastic. Filaments inside were made thicker and shorter to resist breaking. Every component was tested under crushing acceleration until it could survive forces that would liquefy a human body. The tubes were only half the problem. A radio requires power, and batteries present their own nightmare. A conventional battery, left active inside a shell for weeks or months of storage, would drain itself dead before it was ever fired. Yet the fuse needed to be ready instantly the moment it left the barrel. Although the solution was brilliant and simple, the battery would be activated by the shock of firing itself. Engineers designed what they called a reserve battery. The ampule was sealed and inert during storage. When the shell was fired, the violent G-forces shattered the glass. The electrolyte mixed with the active plates, and the battery came to life in a fraction of a second, providing power for the 2-minute flight. Fuse transmitted a continuous radio signal and listened for the echo. When the reflected signal reached a certain strength, a tiny electrical charge fired the detonator. The whole process, from transmission to explosion, took milliseconds. Americans gave it a deceptive name, VT Fuse, which officially stood for Variable Time Fuse. The name was chosen specifically to mislead enemy intelligence into thinking it was just an improved mechanical timer. In reality, VT stood for something far more secret. It was a proximity fuse, packed into a 5-inch shell. By 1943, the design was finalized and tested. Merle Tuve and the military leadership faced a dilemma. It was a secret. If a single VT-fused shell failed to detonate and fell into enemy hands intact, German scientists could reverse engineer the system within weeks. Weapons' effectiveness depended entirely on the enemy not knowing it existed. For over a year, the U.S. military refused to deploy the VT fuse over land, terrified that a dud round would be recovered. Fuses were used exclusively in naval anti-aircraft defense, where any failed shells would sink harmlessly into the ocean. That restriction held until June 1944, when the V-1 attacks began. Severe threats were sent that Winston Churchill personally appealed to President Roosevelt to allow the use of VT fuses over England. Roosevelt agreed, but only under strict conditions. At the coast, the guns were positioned, firing over water. Every gun was equipped with the new American shells, and the orders were absolute. Fire only over the Sai. The invisible mathematics of slaughter. American production was as important as the invention itself. Their factories were producing 40,000 VT fuses every single day by mid-1944. Each cost roughly 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce. By comparison, the VT fuse was a multiplicative weapon. A single gun crew with VT-fused shells could do the work of 10 crews with conventional ammunition. And America had the industrial base to produce them by the millions. Fuses were manufactured in a sprawling network of factories across the United States. Eastman Kodak Company produced the miniature vacuum tubes. Raytheon Company assembled the radio components. Crossley Corporation built the battery systems. Final assembly happened at government arsenals. Each fuse required 147 separate components. Each component had to be machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The production line had to maintain quality control standards higher than peacetime precision instruments, and it had to do so at a pace of 1,700 fuses per hour, per factory. By August 1944, when the diver belt became fully operational, British gun crews didn't need to calculate trajectories anymore. They simply pointed, fired, and let the shells do the thinking. The VT fuse detonated automatically when it detected a target within 70 feet. The kill radius had effectively increased by a factor of 10. On August 28, 1944, the system reached its peak efficiency. 94 V-1s were launched toward London. 77 were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, and the kill rate was 82%. A figure so absurdly high that it defied every pre-war assumption about air defense. German observers across the Channel could only watch in confusion as their invincible missiles tumbled out of the sky in clusters, torn apart by explosions that seemed to chase them through the air. They still didn't know what had changed. 6. Answer lies in their hands. The final bitter irony of the VT fuse came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. When German forces launched their desperate winter offensive through the Ardennes, they overran several American ammunition depots in the opening days of the attack. Among the captured supplies were wooden crates stacked with 5-inch artillery shells, each one clearly marked with American military codes. Some of the shells had an unusual bulbous nose, slightly larger than standard high-explosive rounds. German ordnance officers cataloged the captured ammunition and stored it for potential reuse. A few shells were test-fired by artillery units equipped with captured American guns. They performed adequately. No one bothered to disassemble the strange, bulbous nose. No one examined the internal components. Germany had spent months trying to understand the impossible effectiveness of Allied anti-aircraft fire, and now they held the answer in their hands. Stacked in crates in a Belgian warehouse, they never looked inside. Years later, after the war, German scientists and engineers were shown intact VT fuses by Allied technical intelligence teams. Reaction was universally the same: stunned silence, followed by disbelief. Dr. Herbert Wagner, the same engineer who had proposed and dismissed a similar system in 1940, examined a disassembled VT fuse at a debriefing in 1946. He held the tiny reinforced vacuum tube between his fingers, studied the shock-activated battery, and traced the circuitry of the radio receiver. His assessment was blunt. He said it should not have been possible to manufacture. 7th, silent shield. In the Pacific, VT-fused anti-aircraft shells turned the nightmare of kamikaze attacks into a manageable threat. Japanese pilots who had once relied on speed and surprise found themselves flying into walls of automatically detonating fire. Naval kill rates against attacking aircraft jumped from 20% to over 60%. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces were finally pushed back, American artillery units used VT-fused shells in a ground-burst mode against massed infantry and armor. Shells, set to detonate a few feet above the ground, created lethal air bursts that were far more effective than conventional contact fuses. By the end of the war, over 22 million VT fuses had been produced. They equipped everything from 5-inch naval guns to 90mm anti-aircraft batteries to 135mm howitzers. However, American military estimated that the VT fuse increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by 500% and reduced the ammunition required to destroy a target by 75%. Vannevar Bush, head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, ranked the VT fuse as one of the 3 most important technical developments of World War II, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. The British government later estimated that without the VT fuse, the V1 campaign would have killed an additional 20,000 to 30,000 civilians and forced the partial evacuation of London. Germans believed the proximity fuse was impossible, so they never seriously tried to build it. America believed it was nearly impossible, so they threw their entire industrial base at the problem until the impossible became routine. By the time German scientists held the disassembled answer in their hands, the war was already lost. The V1 was supposed to be invincible. Mathematics said it couldn't be stopped, yet math is only as good as the assumptions behind it. The question it leaves behind is worth asking now. What problems are we dismissing today as impossible, simply because we haven't yet found the will or the way to make them routine?